Well,
So
then,
welcome, Rebecca Johnson. You've read the blurb on the website. That's how you got here. So welcome, and looking forward to an interesting discussion.
okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm joining you by Zoom from The Hague, as I've been doing a week of meetings, actually looking at some of these nuclear challenges we're facing. Clearly, they're on a lot of people's minds, because not only the war launched in February by one of the nuclear armed states that is supposed to be kind of responsible together with the US and UK for the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, and of course that's Russia, we know, has launched an attack in early February on a non-nuclear armed neighbor, presumably expecting to have a quick victory. We of course now know that didn't happen, but within 4 days we were actually hearing President Putin issuing a fairly naked, if maybe slightly blurred, threat, using the fact or the reminder that Russia has a large nuclear arsenal and that, you know, nothing was off the table, essentially. And then repeated that most recently, just last week, on the 21st of September, which I don't know whether intentionally or not, but it seems like a bit of a coincidence that it is the UN designated International Day of Peace, 21st of September, and Putin reiterated essentially that it's prepared, that Russia considers itself to be the victim of the attacks, and that, or the threats, particularly identifying NATO, but also trying to mobilize some kind of in a sense, hatred actually for the Ukrainians themselves who have been resisting, and simultaneously made more nuclear threats and somewhat more explicit, and then stating this is not a bluff, and then instituting these votes within just a couple of days. And I mean, you know, we have to recognize there are a number of complexities there. Some of these areas, you know, were considered part of Russia until about 1954, when Khrushchev decided to make them part of Ukraine in a situation in which the whole of the Soviet Union was governed from Moscow and the Kremlin. And I guess Khrushchev didn't feel that it mattered very much whether you were, and of course, you know, we've been dealing with issues of the silencing of the protests within Russia, of which there are rather a lot, and in fact have been quite a, you know, a number of killings of protesters and resistors, while also some who have protested have suddenly found themselves arrested and then put on buses to become the cannon fodder for Russia's war on Ukraine. So we're in this situation, which is clearly creating a lot of problems, while at the same time we have had 2 major international meetings, both of which got postponed because of COVID, which I attended, and they were the first one, as it turned out, in terms of where it was calendared for by the UN, was in fact the very first meeting of the states parties of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I don't know if you can see that I'm holding up the treaty text here. The meeting was held in Vienna, which is a city that contains both the International Atomic Energy Agency, which oversees and safeguards, but also has a kind of double role, which many of us consider to be really problematic, which is that it's responsible for trying to promote nuclear energy and nuclear technologies for so-called peaceful purposes. Now, I think there's a small number of, I think most of us agree who work on these issues that research reactors that produce certain kinds of isotopes particularly for medical purposes, are not generally, a threat to the world. But the major nuclear power plants that were brought in really in many, many ways as part of the narrative in the 50s to kind of justify having massive nuclear industries that created the enriched uranium and the plutonium for bombs. So Eisenhower came up with this PR concept of atoms for peace. And of course, it went along with the other PR concept that was being promulgated, which is that nuclear weapons are the only form of deterrence. In fact, it became deterrence, which of course has been part of various kinds of defense and security strategies going back to before, we even had the written word in any communities around the world. But what was new in the 50s was that deterrence came to be thought of purely in terms of nuclear weapons, sometimes called strategic deterrence as well, but as if any country that didn't have nuclear weapons was therefore had no way of being had no way of exercising deterrence as part of their defense. Well, that's of course nonsense, because the vast majority of states don't have nuclear weapons, and yet they find a whole toolbox that, and one part of that toolbox is not to have nuclear weapons, is actually makes it far less likely that they're going to be targeted with nuclear weapons. So that's a pretty good deterrent, really, is if you aren't presenting a nuclear threat to others, then you're not on the high list of countries to attack. But of course, now there's a whole rethinking around some of those issues, especially in the media, less so amongst, those of us that kind of work as activists and also analysts within the kind of civil society and with UN governments and so on. But that the very fact that Russia, a nuclear armed state, has invaded Ukraine in a so-called conventionally weaponed or conventionally armed invasion, and then as soon as there is resistance and his plans don't work out to just take over really fast, we get the nuclear threats issued. And of course it is shocking, but we also mustn't forget that's one of the roles of nuclear weapons in the minds of all 9 of the nuclear armed states in one way or another. Tony Blair is the only leader I know of that was actually explicit about this in his memoir when he was reflecting on the usefulness of Britain being a nuclear armed state and him a nuclear armed leader, when he decided to go arm in arm with George Bush Jr. in the invasion on Iraq. Now, we have to ask ourselves, Iraq had no nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction, even though the worries about that and the threat of that was mobilized as part of the justification for the invasion, despite the fact that Hans Blix and other inspectors had gone and looked at all the sites that the US and UK had identified as being places where nuclear, chemical or biological weapons had been produced, which isn't true in the case of nuclear, but was true in the case of chemical and biological, and still, but the point is that had all been eliminated. Those programs had been eliminated in the previous Gulf War. So we're seeing then Tony Blair saying that essentially, because the UK had nuclear weapons, he kind of felt a sort of confidence or freedom of action to join the invasion against a non-nuclear armed, non-WMD armed country. And by doing so, utterly kind of destabilized the whole kind of geopolitical region of the Middle East. Now, nobody's saying that Saddam Hussein was in any way a good leader or even a good person. Of course he wasn't. You know, he'd kept his own people in subjugation. He'd been brutal. But the invasion was nevertheless not justified by the UN. It did not go through a UN decision. So we have to sort of see this kind of a context when we are looking also at what Putin is doing, and recognize that threats are perceived by whichever country feels threatened in different ways from how the country that is identified perhaps as an aggressor or at least an adversary sees their own actions. And that's certainly true of this, and the role of NATO, which actually has 3 nuclear armed states, and both NATO with those 3, the US, UK, France, and Russia from the Kremlin, they each have about 6,000 nuclear weapons. And of those 12 to 13,000 nuclear weapons, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea are the other 4. And they have between them no more than about 250, probably, between those 4 states. And the rest basically are in NATO or in Russia. And of the Russian and the NATO nuclear weapons, most of which are US nuclear weapons, but they are assigned to NATO, we see that there's about 900 on each side surrounding Ukraine, which are kept on what Putin called prompt alert, and we would more normally call hair trigger alert. So this is, and in the first threat that Putin issued, he specifically said he was basically taking or putting Russian nuclear weapons on prompt alert. Well, they already had, 900 of them already were. And we heard initial blustering from both the French and the British, trying to use Putin's language, and then that all got shut down. And I happened to hear this because I was working from home, listening to the TV in the background and working on admin, which always makes me pay a lot of attention to what's coming into my ears as well, because I hate admin. And but we didn't hear any more of it. And then suddenly NATO was actually issuing a common position, which was not to be directly threatening nuclear weapons back, but that they were upping the ante on the sanctions and on indeed sending military aid and arms to the Ukrainians. So all of that is the kind of context. But then here we were in June in Vienna, and there's a meeting of around about 120 or so countries, many of whom have signed and ratified this new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which, for those of you who don't know it, was negotiated under UN General Assembly auspices in 2017. And actually, one of the interesting things for me in just the last 2 days is I've spent a lot of time with Ambassador Elaine White Gomez of Costa Rica, who was the president of those negotiations in 2017 and who brought the treaty home. The Netherlands, which was one of the negotiating states, at the end of when she presented the treaty in the final form as negotiated, and it was on the last day, and really there wasn't going to be more time because there was a window of opportunity, a particular kind of window of opportunity, which the states that wanted a nuclear ban treaty seized on in 2016 that led to UN negotiations in 2017. It had to be adopted on the 7th of July, or it would have to go back to the UN General Assembly. And the assessment by all of us really was that it was not going to be, there was not going to be a vote to allocate more time the following year. Things had already shifted from the possibilities that were, partly because it was a US election in 2016, and Trump didn't care about these issues and he was the one elected, that the US didn't move swiftly to block the UN making that possible through funding and allocation of UN time. So we got that treaty, and it is a fascinating treaty because, first and foremost, I'm going to read this because if we're thinking about nuclear weapons, we need to think about all this in context. And the preamble is often where in a treaty you actually get the meaning of the treaty, the purpose of the treaty. And paragraph 4 says, cognizant that, knowing that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be adequately addressed, transcend national borders, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, socio-economic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations, and have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. Now, there's actually 2 pages of paragraphs in the, no, 3 pages of paragraphs in the preamble. So it covers a number of other things, including the impact of nuclear weapons use and testing in the past on the hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also a lot of communities, mostly indigenous communities around the world, where the states of, particularly the states of the US, UK, France, Russia, and China all conducted their various nuclear weapons test programs. And actually, if you look at India and Pakistan, which are the other 2 that have tested, they tested their nuclear weapons on areas where there were, if not indigenous people, that were different from perhaps the population. Certainly people that were quite poor, living in difficult and often desert kind of regions. That's where nuclear testing was carried out. For the UK, it's the 70th anniversary of the first nuclear test by the UK in 1952. The 70th anniversary is next Monday, 3rd of October, which happens to be my birthday too, which I kind of, when I found that out, I just thought, well, but then it was foretold that I was going to try to ban nuclear testing, because I really don't want to share my birthday with something so horrific. So this is an ongoing problem that that 9 nuclear armed states have continued ever since they conducted their first tests or fired the first missiles to be the delivery vehicles for their warheads. They've carried on. They might call it maybe modernizing, but if we look at it, we call it enhancing. Even as numbers went down from 70,000 nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War, sort of the end of the 80s. And we women of the UK at Greenham Common and the peace movement of Europe played an absolutely crucial role in resisting the new generation of so-called theatre nuclear weapons. I'm talking about the ground-launched cruise missiles, the Pershing ballistic missiles, and the Russian SS-20s, which had been brought in during the late 70s and early 1980s to actually try to rework the theory of deterrence from the 50s into something that was certainly interpreted by the US pundits as being that a nuclear war could be fought and could be won, could be limited to the European theatre, which of course for those of us that live in the European theatre wouldn't have been very limiting. It would have annihilated us. That's what sent so many of us to the peace camps, to the nuclear bases, to Greenham Common first and foremost for many women, but to Molesworth for quite a lot of particularly more kind of Christian oriented men and women. They set up, they even built a chapel outside the fence of the Molesworth base, which was going to get the cruise missiles second. So we went down from 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of when I was at Greenham, and before the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that got rid of the Cruise, the Pershing and the SS-20s, those theatre nuclear weapons, the intermediate, the medium range ones. And now here we are, and we're hearing talk of tactical nuclear weapons, like this is something that Russia can fire a tactical nuclear weapon. And we have pundits who really, frankly, do not know what they're talking about, but are saying, pontificating with apparently great authority to people on the news asking the questions who also don't know what's really going on, saying, well, you know, if I suppose Russia might do a kind of tactical nuclear strike. Don't be fooled. Please don't get stuck in this kind of language and think that a tactical nuclear strike couldn't be retaliated against and turn into a nuclear war. The word tactical actually describes a smaller size of warhead than what are called strategic, and usually a much shorter range, ranging from the literally bombs that get dropped from aircraft, which is one of the forms of nuclear weapons that the US has in bases in Germany and Italy and Netherlands and Belgium. And who am I forgetting now? Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Turkey. Used to have them in the UK, got rid of those from Lakenheath. And then one of our trusted researchers in Washington, a Danish guy called Hans Christensen, who works with the Federation of American Scientists and often writes in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, he found he's the kind of guy that goes through budgets, US budgets from the Department of Energy, which actually is the main department that oversees nuclear weapons production, and also as well as from the defense, and found out that Lakenheath was named again as and a budget item was allocated to Lakenheath, which Hans told us about, said, look out for this, because it's in the budget line for the coming year. It's not clear if, what kind of weapon, but it's for actually readying the base of Lakenheath for the possibility of more nuclear weapons, after the nuclear weapons had already been taken away from there. And I think it was 2008 was when it was confirmed they'd gone. I think they'd gone earlier, but they kind of went under the radar. They didn't announce the nuclear weapons leaving. So that's the kind of context. So all of, the knowledge and also research looking into the humanitarian consequences and impacts of nuclear weapons, essentially what nuclear weapons actually do if used, in terms of the impacts on human beings, on towns, on cities, on agriculture, on climate. If enough, and enough is not very many, not as many as it was thought to be in the 80s, less than 100 bombs used by India and Pakistan against each other, or to put it in perspective closer to home, the nuclear weapons currently carried on one Trident armed UK nuclear submarine at sea on a so-called deterrent patrol. If those UK weapons on one Trident submarine on today's level, they can be armed with a lot more, but we're going on the assumption at the moment of them still carrying roughly what was decided for them to carry after the end of the Cold War, which were less than they were designed to do. If those were fired at Moscow and 5 other medium to large cities in Russia, that alone could be enough. The pulverization of those cities would, as well as kind of creating the big mushroom cloud, some of which would fall to earth and pollute and contaminate large swathes, depending on where the wind blows, as Raymond Briggs' cartoon that some of you might be familiar with. But as well as that, this effect of the pulverization becoming dust clouds, lifting high into the air, essentially encircling the upper atmosphere, kind of entombing the earth with darkness through the sun not being able to get through the dust clouds. The result of that would be nuclear winter. And that's not an answer to global heating. Quite the reverse. It actually does many of the same things, but in more and more unpredictable ways, because it's extreme weather. And as with global heating, nuclear winter affects agriculture's ability to grow food. So we're talking about mass starvation, over 2 billion calculated, and the very recent studies are of more than that. So it doesn't take very much from miscalculation, such as Putin has already shown when he thought he could use the fact that he has a massive nuclear arsenal at his disposal, and that would deter Ukraine from resisting. It would deter any European supporters who are part of the European Union or NATO from retaliating in a way that Russia wouldn't like, and certainly would deter any military threat from any of the NATO countries. Notwithstanding that NATO has the nuclear weapons, but Putin calculated they would not risk using them. Well, that's the theory of deterrence. And of course, the theory of deterrence relies on threatening to use nuclear weapons, which is what Putin did. But we all, I don't know about you all, but you know, people I've been talking to in The Hague, all of us are actually admitting in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, actually almost all of us believed Putin wouldn't be that stupid. He miscalculated, we misjudged, and we are now where we are. So that's been the backdrop of a meeting that in very many ways was very, very good, very strong, laid the foundations, the steps for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into legal force internationally under international law in January of 2021. So this is the first meeting of states parties now that it is in force. And they met together in Vienna, which is a very useful place to do because it's got a lot of nuclear expertise there. And they adopted a very strong declaration. They adopted a number of required decisions. And they also adopted a very good plan of action, if you like, a program of action for how to implement as best as possible the treaty. Now, the big problem is none of the nuclear armed states have yet signed this treaty. So what they're doing is preparing the ground with what would be necessary to bring them into the treaty. And that's one of the things I hope we'll talk about a bit more. But what essentially this treaty does is it prohibits the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons, and then all the kind of operational physical activities from acquiring, manufacturing, acquiring in other ways, deploying, further testing, using or threatening to use nuclear weapons. It also prohibits assisting any state or non-state actors to acquire or use nuclear weapons in any form. And what assisting means is a subject of a fair bit of debate still. But ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which I was one of the co-founders of back in 2009. ICAN started as a project in Australia in 2007. We brought it to Geneva with the strategy to get the nuclear ban treaty. And so we argue, and in fact we have programs like Don't Bank on the Bomb, which directly says to the banks and financial institutions and investment institutions, you know, you really don't want to have investments in nuclear weapons anymore. They're not going to make a profit. They're actually prohibited. If you have any, your head office or subsidiary offices in any country that signs and ratifies, becomes a state party to the treaty, you could well find that you are breaking the law in those countries. And, you know, finance is generally fairly risk averse. So it's actually working on some UK institutions and banks, and certainly some very significant European and Japanese and Asian banks and so on. So it's working, and it's what we as civil society can do. And we can do it because of this treaty. The rest of the treaty focuses on the requirement to reduce and eliminate all nuclear weapons, and how that's going to be done, or at least the principles and objectives. And what we did in Vienna was lay some of the foundations for setting up a science advisory group, and to discuss how we were going to monitor, how we were going to reassure states that they could get rid of their nuclear weapons and be even safer than they are now, but also to reassure each other that if they say they're going to get rid of them, they actually do. The whole verification issue is now much more on the table than it has ever been before for nuclear disarmament. And so that's that treaty. And we came away from there pretty jubilant. Unfortunately, a lot of us came away from it with COVID. It was certainly a super spreader event. So it was a week of really intensive discussions with the Red Cross and ICRC holding a meeting of their own to really highlight the latest research on the humanitarian impacts, with parliamentarians for the TPNW, actually two parliamentarians, Ribeiro, anyway, Streatham MP, a relatively new MP. I think she was part of the 2019 intake. She'd never been to a conference like this, but she'd begun to get involved with CMD, and they suggested her, and also a Scottish MP called Bill Kidd. And so we had MPs there as part of the parliamentarian discussions of parliamentarians from all over the world, including many of the countries that are part of NATO, as well as, of course, nuclear-free countries. So that was a very good thing. And then in August, the long-standing 50-year-old Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons held its meeting in New York at the UN, but it's not strictly speaking a UN treaty. It's depositories, because it was a Cold War treaty, are actually the US, Russia, and also the UK. And that has ended very, very badly. And I was only able to be there for the last week, but that was the kind of week where the deals either get made or the whole thing breaks apart. And on this occasion, it was Russia that vetoed, that blocked the agreement of any kind of agreed outcome document. And on the issue, interestingly, of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, because there was a lot of discussion about that at the Non-Proliferation Treaty meeting, because it's a danger. Both Chernobyl, let's not forget Chernobyl, is also in Ukraine. Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, two major nuclear power plants. Chernobyl already had that incredibly horrendous major nuclear accident in 1986. Zaporizhia became part of the war zone, with Russia actually occupying, but expecting and coercing the nuclear plant workers, who were mostly Ukrainians, to carry on, but in conditions which were absolutely inhumane for them to be doing that, and with missiles flying and mortars and various other kinds of weapons. And both the Ukraine and Russia accused each other of this, but some were hitting pretty close. And had they hit any key part of the containment of the nuclear power plant, could have created an even worse catastrophe than Ukraine, and still could. So a lot of states wanted to actually acknowledge that this is a major danger for the world. And the attacks on nuclear power plants have not been talked about very much at the NPT, apart from people like me and other civil society who keep saying this is really not a good idea for anyone, particularly in areas that might be inundated with rising sea levels, or areas that have major security threats of various different kinds. And we were by and large ignored, because France and Russia and China and increasingly the UK wants to make profits out of selling more technologies, calling it for peaceful purposes, and offering to build nuclear power plants right, left and centre around the world in really very dangerous conditions. And that carried on at the NPT. That was one of the few things that you saw some agreement from those nuclear armed states, but they absolutely watered down everything on nuclear disarmament. Everything that they had agreed to in other review conferences, they basically walked back from, reneged on. And in the end, because of the veto, nothing got adopted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those issues don't get worked on, because the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty process, it goes ahead separately now, but still attached to. It's like a parent-child relationship almost of we launched the Nuclear Ban Treaty out of the 2010 review conference, and then it grew into adulthood in its own right. It entered into force, and it offers a lot of ways to reinforce non-proliferation, but definitely to take forward disarmament. So that's the lie of the land this year that I've certainly been involved with, and I'm just going to open it up and see what you want to talk about, and what questions you might have, and what concerns, and let's see what we can come out with.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca. It's obviously a lot to say. I mean, you could talk forever, I'm sure. I mean, one question I wanted to ask is, why do there need to be so many nuclear weapons? I mean, bearing in mind, half a dozen could just virtually wipe out the world. Why do we need so many?
We don't. We don't actually need any, but because they have fooled each other with this magical theory of realism, in which they have nuclear weapons for deterrence, but they were never satisfied. You could, if you can deter with any nuclear weapons at all, then you could deter probably with one, because they are so horrific, even one. But they were never satisfied with that. They just kept building more, designing more. They couldn't stop. It was like they were, you know, they tried the small ones and they tried the big ones, and then they decided that they could also use the small ones a bit more easily in some. And that's why they all have these arsenals, land, sea, air, mostly, you know, they wanted to be able to deliver them by all these means. But it just places all of us at this incredible level of danger. And just last year, the UK, Boris Johnson's government then, issued this integrated review of security, what was it? Defense, security, and I think it was development was the other word for the, and he raised the cap on how many nuclear weapons the UK could deploy. You know, since the end of the Cold War, the UK had actually reduced, it got rid of a lot of the completely obsolete weapons, like the bombs that you drop off an aeroplane, but sometimes they fall out of an aeroplane for other reasons. You know, this sort of thing. The UK actually swept those all away and dismantled them. And so we know that in fact, the only disarmament the UK is actually engaged in ever is unilateral disarmament. Unfortunately, they also tended to repurpose the plutonium, at least, and some of the, you know, into the next bombs that they were making. But here we are, 2021, and the UK reverses this to say, well, we got down to 160, 180 that we were going to be deploying, but now we're going to go back up, and we're going to go up to, do you know, I'm so tired at the end of this long day of discussions. I'm wanting to say 220, but I would have to double check that, and I don't want to interrupt the flow. Look up integrated review and the FCDO and the MOD. It was meant to be a joint thing. Actually, the Cabinet Office did it, and it was released in March of 2021, and here we are. The UK is going to at least give itself the opportunity, the right to reverse reductions and start making more. And on top of that, the UK suddenly also said, oh, and by the way, we're no longer going to be transparent about what we have. And we're going to do that because of security. And then at the NPT, lo and behold, but the US, UK and France were berating China for not wanting to sign along the dotted line of some text on transparency that had been agreed back in 2000 and then again in 2010. And China was basically saying this is a mockery. And here we are. So I think that answers your question. We do not need more. We actually need less. And the safest for our security, the very safest number of nuclear weapons to have on our soil or in our factories is 0. Anything higher than that, with new technologies like AI and cyber and nanotechnologies and so on, if any country that possesses nuclear weapons can now have those nuclear weapons hacked into and spoofed, or if they can't do it by now, and we know that certainly Russia and China can, so can the US, of course, and I don't know the level of that in the UK and France, but we know India also has those capabilities, but so do a lot of non-state actors, many of whom wouldn't dream of threatening us. But the fact is, nuclear weapons can now be launched and turned on, or at least theoretically, and it won't be long before that is a definite. The meetings I was at in France before coming to The Hague was all about those issues. That the combination of AI, cyber and nuclear weapons is very, very bad. And it's very, very bad, most of all, for the countries that actually possess and store and deploy nuclear weapons. So why don't we get rid of them? It's in our security interests to get rid of them.
Other questions? Oh, hang on. Oh, Guy, he's put a comment in the chat. So you can ask a question in chat as well if you don't want to ask any other way. He says, my nan was an original member of CND.
That's great. Guy, are you able to open up your video just so I can see you? Is that possible? Just so I know who I'm talking to. I think it's really great that your gran was one of the original CNDers, and one of my eldest sister, in fact, also went on one of the Aldermaston marches. I can't remember which. And of course, I was at Greenham Common, and then I was a CND vice chair and helped to organise the 1988 march from London to Aldermaston. Aha. We're giving you a minute, Guy, and then we'll get to see your face, and you can maybe ask another question as well as telling us about your nan.
You must have felt very alone, Rebecca, with those protests, because there was a lot of opposition. A lot of people opposed it, didn't they?
I didn't feel alone. I was surrounded by wonderful women who were really, really active, just like me, and of quite a lot of different ages. And it was very much, it was a collective. It was pretty anarchistic in many ways, but we had the basic principle of non-violence. Our interpretation of that was more active and disruptive than some of the more traditional aspects of some of the peace movements who quite like the word pacifist, whereas we kind of almost saw it as PASSIVIST. We didn't want to be passive in the face of nuclear weapons or in the face of the kind of violence that was coming at us from police every time, particularly after the cruise missiles arrived at Greenham and they started trying to take them out onto our public roads, to so-called melt in the countryside, only to encounter Greenham women and cruise watchers who were local people from lots of local towns. In fact, I think Longmoor, not that all that far, but it's in Hampshire, not Sussex, but it's not that far from Chichester, was one of the places they tried, and the local people came out in force and bogged them down in this pathetic little copse that I'm sure that actually you could have seen that they had nuclear launchers from satellite, and there was Russia certainly had satellites in those days. So I never felt alone. Sometimes I would just go for a walk around the 9 Mile perimeter just to be with my own thoughts. That was a different thing. And you'd cook for 15 because you'd count who was there at your gate. And if word got around that you were cooking food that others liked, round would come 20 more. I remember once doing pancake day, vegan pancakes, and I thought I was just doing it for about 12 people. It ended up being at least 24 once the word got around that there were vegan pancakes at our gate.
Oh, here's Guy. Guy has appeared.
Hi.
Oh, you're muted, Guy.
Hi, sorry, I had to shift around. Yeah, I can't remember how many years ago when I think CND had their 50th anniversary. I can't remember how many years it was. I think the founder came to Crawley to do some kind of honorific thing for my nan. Oh,
that's good. What was your nan's name?
Lila Fox.
Say it again.
Sorry, this microphone's a bit screwy. Lila Fox.
Okay. Oh, well, good for her, and good for you remembering her in this, clearly in a very admiring way for what she did for peace, when she could.
Quaker family.
There you go. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Quakers kept some of us at Greenham going longer than we could have otherwise done, with providing Gore-Texes and the Greenham getaway tent that a Quaker designed, and then it was able to be manufactured very quickly and cheaply because the bailiffs were going after us, as well as the missiles they were trying to clear us out of the way so they could get the missiles out. And sometimes they were sending bailiffs in 2, 3, 4 times a day. You could barely get the kettle on before they came and took the wood that you had just got burning again in the pouring rain. So the Quakers were you know, very special in how they actively, but so are a lot of people. I mean, a lot of peace groups and you know, a lot of course, CND groups and, you know, various different kinds. I mean, and we saw this. Greenham, we started coining by 1983. We didn't just talk about come to Greenham and live in witness and disruption at the nuclear base, although we needed a goodly number of women to be prepared to do that, even if they would just come for a week and then go away for a few weeks and then come back, because it, you know, you could keep quite a lot going with quite a lot of women coming and going. You needed a few to really be staying there. I ended up there for 5 years until the INF Treaty. But we started also then saying, take Greenham home, carry Greenham home. And Peggy Seeger wrote just a most wonderful song and gave it the title, Carry Greenham Home, which was all about take it back to your communities. You know, share it with your families, with your kids. You know, if you're teachers or your doctors or your, you know, firefighters, or you're in the, you know, that you're nurses, or incorporate it into the work you do and talk about it to people, because then they can't isolate us as if we're lunatics, because we're all around them. We're their neighbors, we're their families. And that was what Carry Greenham Home meant, and it meant it around the world, actually.
And would you say that the protests were successful? I mean, can you identify any? I mean, it's difficult to know, you know, what affects what, but can you say that you do feel that it was a successful venture, all of the protests? And... I
could say it with immense confidence, because Gorbachev himself at a meeting of Pugwash back in can't remember what year it was, but it's recently featured in a film by a New Zealand director about coinciding with the 40th anniversary of the walk from Cardiff to Greenham in September of 1981. And they actually got footage. I was in the meeting where he said this, and he basically paid tribute to the women of Greenham Common, or the Greenham Common women, and the peace movement of Europe, because we mobilized attention and gave him, coming in as a new Soviet leader in 1985, the confidence to try and do something that his predecessors had not dared to do, which was to reach out to Reagan, who was an arch Republican, to say, we can't, you know, we can't risk nuclear war. Nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That was actually that key statement that Reagan and Gorbachev agreed when they met in Reykjavik, and they also agreed that they would get rid of these particularly destabilizing cruise missiles, Pershing and SS-20s, so from both sides, and that became the INF Treaty that then was signed in 87, allowed people like me to be able to get on with the rest of our lives, and but also did start the ball rolling backwards, down from the 70,000 down to today's 13,000. But of course 13,000 is still far, 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 and you know, basically you could destroy the earth, you know, 13,000 times over, or certainly what would it be if 100, we're talking about over 1,000 times over, we could destroy the earth with the weapons in current arsenals, even as the weapon states are all congratulating themselves, as they did in New York, about how many they've got rid of. Yeah, but you know, it's like, you know, if somebody's tooled up with, you know, half a dozen guns and goes out of the town, the fact that that's less than they had tooled up with yesterday isn't very reassuring now, is it? And so, you know, again, I just say 0 is the only safe number of nuclear weapons in no one's hands.
Any other questions before I ask my next one?
I've got one. I remember watching that. Oh, what's the title of that documentary? I know Gary Oldman did the voiceover. It was about the ease with which you can pass around nuclear materials through borders and docks and storage and stuff. But it also touched on the fact that when the USSR dissolved, so many warheads and nuclear devices just went AWOL and presumably into private hands. I mean, as much as I'm utterly terrified of big countries and states in general, let alone whether they got weapons, just the idea that, you know, these 100+ pretty potent nuclear devices just disappeared into whoever's hands and they could be used at any point. I mean, also, sorry, tangent here, I was in Arkansas 3 years ago, and I remember in the 80s there was the famous case of one of the warheads that just out of nowhere appeared in the field, and all 3 of the safeties had failed, and I have no idea why it didn't go off. These things happen with a regularity that we don't hear about. That's terrifying. Both of those things terrify me. There you go.
Yeah, there were 2 key things that happened in Europe. One very similar to the one you just described was in Spain, and actually one of the warheads did break apart and cause contamination. The other one was in Thule in Greenland, and again fell out of a plane. And there was the thing that happened again at high. Of course, we all were glad to end the dominance of the nuclear armed blocs and end the Cold War, but there was that period of time when, you know, it wasn't just Russia that stopped paying attention to where its nuclear weapons were. The US, there was some armed cruise missiles being transported on the undercarriage, not even inside, in the undercarriage of a military plane, and the pilot didn't even know that was what he was carrying. So that kind of near misses. And of course we do know, and we actually know from research done by Chatham House, that there have been 13 near misses in terms of the potential for a miscalculation to lead to an exchange of nuclear weapons, a retaliation for something that actually hadn't happened. In the way that because of so many weapons being on prompt alert or hair trigger alert. And that is, of course, as I said, there's 900 of each on each side of the current war in Ukraine of that. So, but I also want to slightly reassure you, because in fact, it was one of the things that the US government moved fairly swiftly to, and then civil society also, and this was kind of, I think Ted Turner gave a huge amount of money to an organization that was working on something called cooperative threat reduction, which was basically trying in a cooperative way, not a coercive way, to engage with Russia on finding where all these weapons, where all the materials were, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And putting them under safe lock and key, and, you know, everything like that. So this is what we had that actually secured a lot of the loose nukes and loose nuclear material. But actually, I mean, Sellafield for years was notorious for losing significant quantities of nuclear bomb usable plutonium out of its ducts, because Sellafield is a reprocessing plant, and it was originally founded to reprocess spent fuel in order to make plutonium for the British nuclear weapons thing. And it then started to market the plutonium for MOX fuel, for example, mixed oxide fuel. But quite a lot of countries really didn't want to mess around with, you know, mixed oxide plutonium uranium fuel, and then they tried to do fast reactors, and they said, okay, well then we can put plutonium in one end of these reactors, and reactors will go on forever because they'll keep recycling the plutonium that gets put in. And these technologies never worked very well, and they ended up being ditched. And so Sellafield and Le Hague in France were really left with a huge quantity, tons and tons of plutonium that we had accepted from countries like Japan and South Korea and various others, that we said we'd reprocess, and those countries don't want it back now. And now what do we do about this stuff? And it's on our it's in our hands. And if anyone did want to launch conventional weapons on some kind of a missile and send it, towards Sellafield, they could create a dirty bomb, maybe not a mushroom cloud, but a dirty bomb that would, spread plutonium all over the place. So could just an accident with fire on a nuclear train with spent fuel, or indeed all those nuclear warhead convoys that go from Aldermaston and Burfield, the two nuclear bomb factories in Berkshire, very near Greenham Common, quite near Newbury, between Newbury and Basingstoke, to give you a location. And they take usually 6 bombs at a time up on motorways, on roads, on ordinary roads, up to Coulport, where they're stored in Scotland. And then they are loaded onto the nose cones of American Trident missiles, and then lowered into the Vanguard nuclear powered and therefore nuclear armed submarines, and off they go, meant to hide on these so-called continuous at-sea deterrence patrols. Now, I don't just want to talk about the dangers, because I think we can just get stuck on that. I want everyone to know what the humanitarian impacts are. This is actually what nuclear weapons do. They don't actually do deterrence. If they did, there would be no war in Ukraine as we speak. If deterrence worked, that Ukraine war couldn't have happened. That's what they kept promising us. But of course, miscalculations happen all the time with deterrence, and if with nuclear weapons, it can be so much more serious, and that's what we do have. And also the way in which countries or leaders particularly that have control over nuclear weapons, they don't just see it as a deterrent, they see it as force projection. They see it in the way that Tony Blair felt that, it gave him freedom of action to go into the Iraq war. They see it in all these other kind, giving them status in the world that maybe they don't deserve, for the country that they are now. Maybe they had delusions of grandeur through colonialism or military industrial power or whatever they wanted to attach to. But there's a whole lot more countries out in the world, and there's a whole lot more kinds of security out there. And the vast majority of countries in the world don't look to nuclear weapons to provide security. They look to nuclear disarmament and the Nuclear Ban Treaty to provide a security that would affect their people. But we still get the nuclear armed state saying, well, security, strategic security is all about us with our nuclear weapons. No, this really isn't the world we now live in. The only kind of security that makes any sense at all is cooperative security. And we have got to find the way to do that, because we've got to get a handle on the fossil fuel driven destruction of the climate and environment as well. And that's very much a military industrial technology, as well as the military industrial technologies of nuclear, and they're hand in glove. And we've got to tackle them hand in glove. And we can. And the next generation of the climate activists are the same age now, what they're doing. Most of them, some of them started younger than me, but then some Greenham women started younger than me, but they're the next generation, and they are having to protest to save the planet so that they can even raise children with or have any possibility of that. And we have got to be out there with them in every way we can, because we help to contribute to this mess.
You must be very worried about the possibility that Russia breaks up into lots of states, all the different countries within Russia, because I think the nuclear bombs are spread all over the place. So you'd suddenly have, maybe instead of one Russia, you might have like a dozen countries now with nuclear weapons.
Do you know, that's actually what happened with the Soviet Union, of course, because the Soviet Union, in fact, was a union of Soviet socialist republics, which actually meant it was a kind of artificial construct made out of a lot of countries that had been independent and now, you know, were called the USSR, but of course it was Moscow and the Kremlin centralized. That is what happened. And Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, they had nuclear weapons, and they also had quite a lot of nuclear infrastructure. Now, what they didn't have was any of the operational command and control for those nuclear weapons. But the fact is that what has happened now is going to act as, I think, it's potentially going to create the most almighty shock if nuclear weapons, even a so-called tactical, you know, a small nuclear weapon, that is going to be a strategic use, and it's going to be strategic intent, and it's going to have a strategic impact. Now, that can go one of two ways. We can start having retaliations, and we can actually have that escalating into nuclear war, or the world is going to pull back and go, okay, this is what all those civil societies and scientists and so on all said could happen. They were the realists. We are the realists, because we've looked at them and said these are the mechanisms by which our humans sort of leaders and their reliance on certain kinds of technologies, increasingly sophisticated technologies, but also increasingly likely to be so automated that the miscalculations become greatly amplified. That's what's happened. We could come out of this shock and everybody join the treaty. That's what happened with the NPT. You know, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Ireland put that on the table in 1958 as nuclear non-proliferation, as in not to spread nuclear weapons beyond the countries that already had them, which at the time that Ireland did that, it was actually just the three. It was US, UK, and Soviet. Ireland put that on the table, and Sweden picked it up and ran with it a little bit more. But it was really saying we can stop the spread of nuclear weapons only by moving towards nuclear disarmament. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the US, Soviet Union, and junior partner to the US, UK, that seized hold of this idea of the treaty and then turned it into mainly about just stopping the spread. And for them, 5 by that time, because it included France and China, to hang on to them. And 50 years later, we've not just got that 5, we've got 9. But in those 5, we've now seen highly irresponsible, highly dangerous leaders, populist leaders, bonkers leaders in some cases, leaders completely unchecked by their own governments or their own military in a number of cases of those 9 governments, and they control and wield nuclear weapons. We can't believe any longer that these weapons are going to prevent war or keep us safe. So the only solution, and fortunately we've at least got the text of the treaty, we don't even have to go to another set of negotiations, and but what we would like to see is the pressure from civil society and the parliamentarians on, like, the Labour Party, particularly if they're preparing for government. Of course, they're running away from that because they associate it with Jeremy Corbyn, who's, you know, been anti-nuclear for a very long time. But you know, was the wrong leader for the Labour Party at the wrong time and in the wrong way for various kinds of reasons. We don't have to go into it. But, you know, defining yourself as not Jeremy Corbyn seems to have been translated by Keir Starmer as hiding behind nuclear weapons yet again, in the way that Theresa May insisted on doing, and look what we now have with Liz Truss. So what is Labour doing in this day and age? Not waking up to the 21st century, where nuclear weapons have no place in security. They are a problem for our national security, health and environment, and also for the whole world's security. We are part of the problem. The nuclear weapons are a problem that needs to be dealt with and managed, highly expensively managed, until they are completely eliminated. They're not an asset in any shape or form. Not only that, but in my analysis, this is stealing security from the people. In every country that spends money and has nuclear weapons, they are stealing health security, education security, housing security, security for older age, security for families with young children, because the resources are getting poured into the military.
Well, ironically, it could be economic. You mentioning about the economics and the colossal waste of money. I mean, I think America is absolutely enormous amount they spend on the military. Ironically, it could be the economics that is the downfall of Russia, because they've just blown everything they've spent, and sanctions, of course, but they couldn't. Well, that was the reason why the Soviet Empire failed. Of course, they just couldn't keep up with the race. So yeah, I think economics is going to be their downfall.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, when you asked the question about, you know, how do we know that we played a role, and I mentioned Gorbachev. I didn't mention how many members of the US military that are now. I started meeting, because I started working on treaties. I started being invited to conferences where I was rubbing shoulders with, NATO militaries, and also particularly US, including some that in discussion over drinks and things in the, after the dinner and things like that, was saying, oh, the last time I was in England, I was at Greenham Common. And I said, well, fancy that. So was I. No, I didn't. I generally kept a bit quiet at those times, only to plant a few questions like, well, so what did you think of what the women were doing? And do you think that they had any impact? And these people who said, oh, I was a major then, and of course they're now a colonel, or they were then, when I was talking to them, they were sometimes even general level. And they were basically saying, well, they caused immense demoralization for us. We could not deploy these weapons without women popping up all over the place and disrupting, and also we had to go in and out of the gates of the base in snow and rain and all kinds of weather. And we thought we were hardened through our training to do all of this stuff, and we were just seeing these women, often with children, but these women of all ages, just living out there because they believed passionately that we shouldn't be deploying these weapons. And the guy I'm particularly thinking of having that conversation with was saying it was really demoralizing for all of us doing that day by day by day, and we were very glad to leave. Well, of course, Thatcher tried not to let anyone give any credit to the Greenham women or the peace movement, claimed it was purely negotiation from strength between the leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan, but who pushed them in the two different directions. Gorbachev, as I said, has acknowledged the role of the Greenham women in the peace movement of Europe, and certainly Reagan's wife, Nancy Reagan, acknowledged, I think in a memoir that she did, that what the physicians against nuclear war were talking about, the nuclear winter studies and famine and these sorts of things. She brought a couple of those physicians into the White House to talk to Reagan. And, you know, he was never quite the same after that. It really went deep into him. And there's also a quote from Gorbachev also saying the winter study, the nuclear winter studies really clinched it for him that a nuclear war could not be won and therefore must never be fought.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Any last questions?
I was going to say,
go on.
I was going to say, sorry. I do wonder now, because obviously, you know, warfare's moved on to drones and neutron bombs and things that make nuclear bombs look. Do you think they have more of a kind of a totemic thing because they're so, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki in people's memories? But even Eisenhower, when he left office in, was it 59, his leaving address, which was said, you know, the next 60 years of history is going to be the military-industrial complex just writing blank checks and doing whatever they want. And we've had proxy wars in Afghanistan between Russia and America, and we've got a semi-proxy war going on right now. And in the public consciousness, nuclear weapons are there, but the horrors of things like drones, I mean, the fact they use plutonium-laced shells in the Gulf War I, which means parts of Iraq are still irradiated. You know, it's a weird one to me because obviously we've gone beyond nuclear, but they're still in our conscience and they're still a thing, and people have seen the tangible effect of it. But, you know, people over here have never seen a drone strike. People over here probably don't even know what a neutron bomb is, even though a neutron bomb is a thing. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I have to correct one thing. There were never ever plutonium-laced shells. What I think you're talking about were the tips of missiles, the so-called conventional cruise in some cases and various others, to be tank busting. They found that when they took the enriched uranium out to go and make the nuclear bombs, in the US, the UK, and others, but particularly this was driven by the US, what was known as the depleted uranium was very, very hard and could be coated, the tips, and that became tank penetrating. But because having penetrated the tank and then exploded with conventional weapons, it actually spread all that dust a bit like asbestos in some ways. And it's certainly, there's been a lot of evidence suggesting that it has contaminated, but not so much as a nuclear contamination as more like a lead type heavy metal contamination. Nevertheless, it's a contamination. It's carcinogenic. You know, this made a lot of the service people inside those tanks who managed to survive, or you know, handling this stuff and having it explode near them, and then you know, moving stuff, including quite a lot of British squaddies and so on. But I just needed to correct that because there have been no plutonium laced shells because that would have made it a nuclear weapon. But yes, these and the drones and all of these, you know, this is where I think this is how we mobilized for this treaty was we kind of almost went away from all the arguments about types of weapons, and I know I have been talking about them here, and started looking at what do these weapons actually do, and then what do combinations of these weapons do, which is often not just twice as much, but a multiplication. And certainly, as I said, you know, nuclear weapons plus AI or cyber are really, really bad ideas. Any kind of automated, you know, these lethal automated weapon systems that are increasingly coming in. And there's various non-lethal, but they're not non-lethal, actually, you know, I mean, even a rubber bullet, you know, aimed in somebody's eye can kill. So, and that's considered a non-lethal weapon. We have to recognize, to deal with all of the scientists and those who profit from making arms and selling arms, the whole arms trade. And Britain increasingly, particularly if you look at how the Tory party looks at where they expect to keep going. They've stripped bare most of manufacturing and most of our industry, other than the heavy industry of weaponry, and we get top dollar from the Saudis and others like those. And anything we can't get top dollar of, the British taxpayer actually pays incentives for countries that have them, and they often end up on black markets, and they end up all over the world, fighting in these different kinds of, you know, warfares imposed, you know, on neighboring countries and so on. And British weapons, US weapons, Russian weapons, Chinese weapons, French weapons, you know, they constantly turn up in war zones, while it's pontificated again, you know, against those of us who say get rid of nuclear weapons, that nuclear weapons keep the peace. No, they don't. And arms manufacturing depends on more and more and more. And it doesn't matter what the weapon is, they will always find something, some way to try and enhance it. And it can never be about the numbers either. So we actually have to get away from all of this. And again, this is our responsibility. And we have got to delegitimize the use of force in international relations. So again, this has been a very big shock. Shocks either can wake us up, and I hope that that is what this Ukraine war does, and that we also then we need to put the kind of resources into rebuilding Ukraine that all of our weapons manufacturers were keen to make in selling their weapons and their trainers to train the Ukrainian army in using all these weapons. But that often isn't what happens, is it? You know, it's like money can always be found for war, but they seldom put the money aside to be able to build the peaceful relations that won't create the next war. And that sounds like a pretty negative place to end, but I still have hope. That's why I come to these places and I have these conversations, and you know, and sitting in these panels with Elaine White Gomez from Costa Rica, who was the president, highly a wonderful president, really excellent negotiator, who brought the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons home under the deadline that we had, which was the 7th of July, so that we actually had a treaty and got it adopted. 122 governments with one abstention, which is Singapore, and one vote against, which was the Netherlands. And talking about, you know, what we're then now in a position to do, which is build up verification systems for nuclear disarmament, which we've never been in the position to do before. And we now have a treaty that actually creates the conditions for nuclear weapons to actually be eliminated. And that allows us to go back to the governments and say, you don't have a leg to stand on. It's not an impossible thing. We can put you know, the UK has unilaterally done all this work on eliminating its nuclear weapons. How can they say, oh, we don't know how to do that? Of course they know how to do that. They just didn't want anyone to be monitoring it. But down at the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp every month, there are a number of women. It was something I founded in 1985 when I needed a little holiday from Greenham. I went to Aldermaston with 2 other women, and we camped outside something called the Falcon Gate, which also had a pub. And we started to bear witness to what was going on at Aldermaston, which was the first Trident after the Polaris, the first Trident being built there. And we've kept on. And the only break we ever had was during lockdown. I mean, that's incredible.
Mm.
And we actually need, we don't need to I don't think we can replicate identically what we succeeded in mobilizing in the 80s that brought about the INF Treaty and got rid of Cruise and Pershing and SS-20s. But there are mechanisms and campaigns and tools that we have now that we never dreamt of then. And we can harness those. And a lot of young people are harnessing those, but they could do with a lot more help from some of us, because we've got less to lose. Whatever your life is and whatever your belief system is, there are always things that you can do to make the world a better place for everyone in it now and for those to come after us. And what better a thing can we be trying to do while we live on this earth? So
Yeah.
go to it. Let's all go to it.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for ending on that positive note, and we'll certainly spread the word a bit, and the video will go online, and I think a lot of positive things will happen, hopefully in time.
Great.
Thanks very much, Rebecca.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
And yeah, I hope that you feel more informed and also inspired, because that's what we need, isn't it, in our lives?
Yeah. Thank you.
So take care, all of you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming and taking part.
Yeah. Bye, all of you. Bye.